Confession Ritual. This is the story of a man named Ken-chan, who traveled back to the village where his relatives live, because his uncle had passed away, and a funeral and confession ritual were being held. He was surprised because the funeral seemed particularly lively, and there were no monks to perform the ceremony. After a while, the ritual began, seemingly in order of seniority, allowing people to enter the room where his uncle's body lay. His aunt explained that this was the confession ritual, believed to help the deceased let go of sins if one confesses secrets that were never shared. She told him to observe how relieved everyone looked when they came out. Then it was Ken-chan's turn to go in. His aunt reassured him not to worry about how small his secret might be. In that room he could confess anything. Ken-chan felt nervous, because he hadn't seen his uncle in a long time, and didn't know what to confess, but his aunt insisted it was time for him to go in. As he entered the room, he saw his uncle's body lying there, covered with a white cloth. He paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. There was one thing he had been thinking about, that he felt he couldn't say, but then he realized that if it could help his uncle let go of the sins he had committed, and allow his spirit to find peace, then he would speak. He leaned down and told his uncle's body, "I'm sorry about the accident that caused your death." Suddenly, a gust of wind blew the cloth covering the face, and the candle went out. He was so startled that he stepped back, but he thought it was just the wind. Just as he was about to leave the room, his uncle's body suddenly sat up. Omiya-san. This is the story of a newly appointed teacher who just moved from Tokyo to teach at a junior high school in the countryside. At noon, all the students invited their new teacher to have lunch with them. While everyone was excited and curious about what the lunch would be, one student caught a whiff of food and guessed that it was Omini-san. Moments later, the housekeeper brought in the food. The students asked the teacher if she didn't know what Omini-san was, and they insisted that if she tried it, she would definitely love it. When the housekeeper opened the pot, she noticed that the contents looked like something with disgusting purple lumps. That didn't seem appetizing at all, but all the students appeared to enjoy it very much. Everyone ate Omini-san with delight, except for the teacher, who couldn't see what was appealing about it. She observed the kids devouring Omini-san greedily, which made it even harder for her to eat. She decided to pack the Omini-san into a bag before she would throw it away, but she noticed that the Omini-san seemed to move slightly. However, she didn't pay attention and walked back home. Feeling hungry, because she had only eaten fruit and milk for lunch, she stopped at a restaurant to eat on her way back. After she had been eating for a while, a customer who had just entered the restaurant asked for Omini-san. They said that after working hard, one needed to eat something to regain strength, and those people were eating greedily, which made her feel nauseous. She decided to leave the restaurant. The next morning, she felt unwell, so she called in sick. The aunt, the owner of the house, came in and saw that she didn't look well. That evening, the aunt cooked for her and asked how she was feeling. She said she was feeling much better and would probably return to work as usual the next day. The aunt said it was great to see her appetite returning and told her to eat a lot to regain her strength. She said the food the aunt made was very delicious. The aunt asked if she hadn't eaten at all while at school. She was taken aback for a moment and looked at the dishes in front of her until the aunt mentioned that she had mixed it into the vegetables to make it easier to eat. Omini-san, she liked it immediately, not realizing that she had just eaten Omini-san. But suddenly, her gaze changed, and she started to drool as if she wanted to eat it again. Insect. This is the story of a man who continuously writes in his diary every day. But it seems that what he writes is filled with anger, and hatred, more like a venting of frustrations. He writes about being criticized by his boss and being gossiped about by the women at work. One day, while he is writing, he feels annoyed by an insect flying around the light bulb, so he lights a mosquito repellent. As days go by, he continues to record negative things, and his frustrations from work spill over into his personal life. He notes his disgust for a foolish couple on a rainy day, who huddle together under one umbrella. That night, the mosquitoes and insects he had lit the repellent for disappeared, but 2 moths came to annoy him instead. He felt even angrier at the couple, so he used insect spray to kill them, and even struck a match to burn them with satisfaction. However, the next day, while he was writing, he noticed an increase in insects from who knows where. He lit more repellent, and suddenly, he heard the loud crying of a baby. In his anger, he threw an insect spray can at the wall and told it to shut up. As time goes by, he becomes increasingly annoyed, to the point where he starts to be irritated by himself and everything around him. He picks up a mirror to look at himself and notices that some insects are crawling in his eyes. Ultimately, when everything becomes too much, the insects, the sound of the baby, and the insect repellent releasing smoke everywhere, combined with hatred, annoyance, and the lack of improvement in his situation, he begins to write that he will kill them all. But in the end, the one who dies turns out to be him, along with his hatred, and everything around him in a pitiful state, and there is no one left. In reality, the annoying insects were not anywhere else, but within himself. This is the story of a university student who accidentally finds something forgotten on a shelf in a train. What he finds is a folder containing some documents. But when he opens it, he discovers it is a decorated novel. After the festival, as he reads it more and more, he finds it both fun and interesting, so much so that he loses track of time, and even forgets where he got off the train to read. He feels a chill because it seems he has been enchanted by something while reading. He considers throwing it away, but first he encounters a sign for a novel writing contest, with a prize of 3 million yen, or about 870,000 baht, which stirs greed within him, prompting him to submit the novel for the contest. The following week at his home, he received a phone call informing him that he had won the grand prize for the novel he submitted. The caller asked for confirmation that he was indeed the author of that novel, to which he replied yes. At the award ceremony, a man congratulated him and asked what he planned to do with the prize money, but he still didn't know. The man then asked him again to confirm for the last time that he was the true author of the work, and he reaffirmed his answer. However, when he went on stage to receive the award, he noticed that the attendees were unusually quiet and still. As he received the award, the audience that had been applauding turned into skeletons. He was shocked and wondered what was happening. The man from earlier approached him, now in the form of a skeleton, to congratulate him. Out of fear, he tried to confess that he was not the one who wrote the novel. Suddenly, everything went silent. The skeleton asked him closely, "But you confirmed it, didn't you? Because I asked you before." Then the man turned into smoke and vanished, and a skeletal hand reached from behind him, pulling him into the realm of the dead, leaving him with his last words, "I'm sorry." Netsuke is the story of a university student who helps organize items at her grandmother's shop. She tells her grandmother that she would like to take some old items from her childhood as keepsakes. Her grandmother says she can take as much as she wants, and adds that her late grandfather would be very happy to know she is taking these things. At that moment, she looks at a picture of her grandfather on the table and notices a box under it. She asks her grandmother what it is, and her grandmother tells her it contains a netsuke that her grandfather cherished. She doesn't know what a netsuke is, and her grandmother mentions that she once opened it, which made her grandfather very angry. Curious, she decides to open it and finds it resembles a pendant of two women's faces. She decides to turn it into earrings because she thinks it's beautiful. On her way home at the train station, she hears a woman's voice saying, "Give it back." Looking around, she sees only men and thinks she must be imagining things. When she gets off the train, it is already dark, and with only one streetlight she can barely see. The voice saying, "Give it back," echoes again, and this time she sees what looks like two people standing far away. She wondered if the voice came from them, but she couldn't see clearly, and thought they might be looking her way. Feeling scared, she hurried into an alley just as a bus passed by, thinking the two might just be waiting for the bus. As she was about to leave the alley, the two women suddenly rushed at her, catching her off guard, and chased her while shouting, "Give it back! Give it back!" She was confused about what she had taken from whom, and what they wanted back. Just then, a bus from the other side stopped right in front of her, and she quickly ran on without thinking, while the hands of the women pursuing her were close behind, almost grabbing her. In the chaos, one of her earrings got caught and fell off, shattering on the ground. Out of fear, she hurried onto the bus and returned to her grandmother's shop. She thought the two women must be after the earrings she was wearing, so she hadn't taken anything strange, except for that pair. However, she told her grandmother that she had lost one, even though it had just fallen and broken. Her grandmother mentioned that someone had come to see her earlier, but didn't know where they had gone. After a while, her grandmother said, "Look, they're here." And they were standing right behind her. When she turned around, she saw the two women. One of them came with a face marred by the earrings she had dropped and broken. Leading drum. This is the story of a couple who recently moved to a village in the countryside. As they walked into the village, they encountered a drum along the way, which they thought might be part of a local event or festival. They met the village headman, who took them on a tour around the village. The wife asked if the headman had seen the drum along the road leading to their home. The headman explained that the drum is part of a village tradition, placed to guide newcomers to their homes, and to bless them with good fortune. They then stopped at the shrine of the guardian spirit that has protected the village since ancient times. The husband remarked that the spirit would also follow the drum to visit their home. The headman confirmed this. Late that night, the wife remarked to her husband that the people in the village were nice, but there was no response, as it seemed her husband had fallen asleep. Suddenly, she heard the sound of the drum growing louder. She thought it might be the wind causing the noise, but upon closer inspection she realized it was not the case, as the drum was shaking on its own, accompanied by a faint sound resembling a baby's cry. Terrified, she tried to wake her husband, but no matter how she tried, he wouldn't wake up. The sound of the drum continued to approach her house, and when it reached her front door, it fell silent. However, when she turned back to her husband, his face had transformed to that of a baby, and he began to cry loudly, the sound echoing throughout the village. Can I borrow it? This is the story of a young man who just finished work and walked past a bathhouse. At first glance, he was surprised because he didn't know there was a bathhouse in this area, but he didn't think much of it due to his exhaustion from work. He figured that at this late hour, there wouldn't be anyone using the service, so he decided to go in to soak and feel better. Upon entering, he encountered the owner, an old man who was very elderly. The old man handed him soap, shampoo, and a towel, and he thought to himself if someone this old still had to work in such a place. Once he entered the bathhouse, it was just as he expected. It was very empty, because there was no one using the service at that moment. While he was bathing, he heard a voice from the opposite side, which was the women's bathhouse. Suddenly, a woman shouted across, asking, "Excuse me, is anyone there?" The young man responded to her, and she asked to borrow a bar of soap from him. He then threw a bar of soap over to her. Not long after, she asked again if there was a water bucket left inside, and if she could borrow it. The young man was surprised that there was no water bucket on her side, especially since it was so late, and there shouldn't be many people using the service. However, she mentioned that there were people using it all. He didn't think much of it, and threw a water bucket to her again. Suddenly, she asked if she could borrow a razor. The young man replied, "I'm sorry, I just passed by on my way home, so I don't have a razor with me." She then asked if he had scissors. He muttered to himself, "Scissors? Who brings scissors to take a bath?" He replied that he didn't have scissors either. The woman then complained to herself, saying it was unfortunate. "If there are no scissors, how will I cut it? I guess I will have to use a det," she muttered, not listening to the young man at all, who was trying to tell her to ask the bathhouse owner outside. The young man was puzzled by what she was complaining about all by herself, until she said, "Excuse me, can I borrow your hair?" He was shocked at what she was saying, and she continued without stopping, asking to borrow his fingers, ears and nose as well. The young man began to think that she was becoming abnormal, so he tried to ignore her and let her talk to herself. She kept asking for pieces of his body, her voice echoing throughout the bathhouse, making him feel scared. He hoped that if he went outside, he wouldn't encounter her. But before he could finish rinsing his hair, a figure appeared that resembled a woman's head, holding a bar of soap in her mouth and a giant pair of scissors in front of him, telling him that she actually wanted all of his belongings. After that, the young man's voice went silent, leaving only the sound of the water tap still running. The young man's body was slowly pulled up, or swallowed whole by something. Tunnel. This is a story about two tourists who were lost while driving to a hot spring late at night. At that moment, they had almost no fuel left to keep searching for a way. If they ran out of gas in the mountains, it would be a terrible situation. They blamed each other until they reached a fork in the road, where the left path led up the mountain, and the right was the entrance to a tunnel. The man looking at the map said he was surprised because this tunnel was not on the map. However, since they had been searching for a long time and their fuel was running low, they decided to drive into the unmarked tunnel. Before long, they ran out of gas and had to get out to push the car. The headlights of the car showed no sign of an easy exit from the tunnel, so they stopped to rest and wait for another vehicle to pass by to ask for help. At that moment, they noticed a slimy substance spread throughout the tunnel, but they thought nothing of it and got back in the car to rest. While they were complaining, the faces of a boy and a girl suddenly appeared beside the car window silently. Both were stunned for a moment, and were about to ask about a gas station, when the faces of the two children moved to the front of the car. Before their eyes, the necks of the children slowly elongated, revealing their greenish throats. Suddenly, the faces of the two children slammed against the car's windshield. They were startled and screamed, wondering what these creatures were. Before they could recover from their confusion, another pair of similar children's faces slammed against the glass repeatedly, revealing that those faces were merely the claws of a giant spider. It slowly crawled up to the roof of the car. The two men tried to close all the car windows, but one window at the back remained open. The driver reached out to close it, but it was too late. The faces of the two children entered the car in a distorted manner, before both were attacked by the giant spider. Not long after, another car drove in and collided with something. The man got out of the car to check underneath, but found nothing. However, he noticed the headlights of the first couple's car parked there. When he got back into his car, he encountered the faces of both of them in the back seat before it attacked the other man. It revealed that in the tunnel there are only monsters, filled with the faces of people who have lost their way in that tunnel. It is about a couple, Tian-chan and Mashiko, who just moved into an old apartment. The reason they moved here was to save money, because the rent is very cheap. While moving their belongings in, Tian-chan noticed a rat, which made Mashiko tremble in fear. However, Tian-chan reassured her that the apartment is old, and it's not unusual to have some rats. She would get used to it soon. Despite this, Mashiko still felt scared. That night, a rat bit her finger, waking her up in pain. She called for Tian-chan, but he didn't wake up. At that moment, she could still hear the sounds of the rats in her room, so she tried to force herself to sleep under the blanket, thinking if she could really get used to this. The next morning, after Tian-chan learned about the incident, he set up rat traps and told her to take care of herself because he would be away for work in another province for 2 days. Tian-chan was very worried about Mashiko and wanted her to adjust since she chose to move here herself, but she was still afraid that the rats would bite her again, especially with Tian-chan not around. He reassured her not to worry because he had already set up the traps. Before he walked out of the house, she suddenly heard their sounds, but she tried to gather her courage and thought that they were just small rats and would be fine. She would get used to it soon. That night, as she had to sleep alone, they all stared at her, and in her mind, she kept telling herself that it was okay. It was okay. She would get used to it soon, while they made loud noises throughout the room. Two days later, Tian-chan returned from work. As soon as he got home, he shouted for Mashiko, and her voice lazily responded, welcoming him as she opened the door. Tian-chan was shocked when a swarm of rats rushed out of that room, and was stunned by the sight before him. Now, Mashiko's face had changed. Her big round eyes, elongated face, and whiskers indicated that she had turned into a rat. Tian-chan opened his mouth, speechless, and Mashiko said, "What you said is true. They have really gotten used to me," laughing as Tian-chan screamed in fear. Noisy room in the hospital. This is the story of a man walking on a dimly lit hospital balcony. The clock nearby shows it is 2:15 a.m. He passes by a room where, looking out the window, he sees a truck carrying several smooth-skinned mannequins driving away. After a while, he notices a light shining from a room at the end of the hall. He wonders what could be happening in that room at such a late hour, and as he approaches, he hears laughter coming from inside. He decides to open the door, and the first thing he sees is a group of doctors and nurses gathered, laughing at something in front of them. He walks closer to see what they are laughing at, but he is shocked to find that it is his own body lying on the operating table. Suddenly, the doctors and nurses slowly turned to him, and he was so frightened that he jolted awake from the dream, mumbling to himself, "Am I really so afraid of the physical exam that I dreamt about it?" When he turned around, he found that his back was soaked with sweat, leaving wet marks on the bed. He pressed the nurse call button, but it seemed to be malfunctioning, so he had to get up and go request a bed change himself. However, when he reached the contact room, he found no one there, just a sign stating that staff were on rounds. At that moment, he noticed a flashlight beam moving down to the lower floor, so he hurried to follow it. The light turned a corner, and he quickened his pace to catch up, but he was startled and fell. When an old man suddenly rushed out from the direction of the flashlight he was following and walked past as if nothing had happened. When he turned back to look, the flashlight beam had disappeared, but he continued walking in the darkness. The clock nearby shows it is 2:15 a.m., and he begins to feel a sense of déjà vu, unable to pinpoint why. He sees the truck carrying smooth-skinned mannequins driving away, and he realizes that everything happening now had occurred in a previous dream. He encounters the same room with the lights on, and laughter spilling out, recalling a conversation he had with a nurse late at night about that room, who warned him not to enter because it was against hospital rules. His curiosity outweighs the warning, and he immediately opens the door. Suddenly, a gust of wind rushes out from inside, knocking him down. However, when the door opens, he finds the room empty, with only a dusty operating table and cluttered items covered in cobwebs, as if the room hadn't been used in a long time. The laughter and light from earlier have vanished, leaving only silence and an eerie stillness. He walked back to his patient room, mumbling to himself about who was laughing and shining lights at this late hour. Just as he was still wondering, the laughter and lights began to draw closer, making him feel scared, and he pulled the blanket over his head. After a while, the sounds faded away, so he slowly opened the blanket to look. To his shock, he found them, standing over him, their tall, faceless bodies with only wide mouths resembling their heads. In their hands, they held instruments ready to perform surgery on his body, moving his limbs as if they were mere puppets. They laughed loudly, while the man thought that what was happening might just be a dream, but in reality, it was the truth. The scene shifts to the old man who had previously rushed past the young man, standing and watching the light from the room that was on, hearing the laughter spilling out. A nurse then came to call the old man back to the supply room, reminding him once again not to go near that room at all, because it was against the rules of this hospital.